Hello ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to today's training titled Becoming a Security Master, Building a Technical Practice for Enterprise Customers. My name is Maike, and I will be in the meeting for the first 15 minutes. So if you have any issues, you can contact me by typing a message in the IM window. I am logged into this meeting as meeting operator. You can also send our team an email. The email address will be posted in the IM chat in a minute. During this session, you have the ability to ask questions using the IM window. Please note that this session is being recorded. And now I would like to welcome your instructors. Mani, you have the floor.
Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining our second community call for the 8-week challenge for security. Throughout the 8 weeks. But before we kick off with the topic today, I wanted to just quickly step back and go through what you would have received to date and just kind of recap where we're at. So week 1, you would have received some communications, and we did our first community call on the market opportunity and the partner opportunity when looking at building out a security practice, and that was presented by Ian Hurd. So if you haven't seen that, go into our resource page and watch that and download the presentation. Week 2 was all about the licensing 101. So what are those licensing SKUs you have against the products that make up a security practice? And then we also talked around the benefits that you have as part of your MPN membership and some of those things that you probably didn't realize you had that you could leverage as you build out your practice. So now we're on to week 3, where we start diving into the technical side of building out a practice. So today we've brought in our resident solution architect, Kenny, to run through some of the key technical areas when looking at building out a security practice for customers in the enterprise. Now, you would have seen, for those that have been on Yammer, thank you for those that have been communicating areas so that Kenny can spend some time deep diving into the sections. So today we're going to cover identity and access management and information protection. The other key areas of threat protection and intelligent security management will be recorded post this call by Kenny, and we'll make sure it's uploaded onto the resource page. We just really wanted to make sure that we allowed enough time for you to get as much detail as possible on each of the topics, and then you're able to ask questions after the call with Kenny, and then also through Yammer as well. So with that, I'm going to hand over to Kenny to get us started in deep diving into the technical space of building a practice.
Great, thank you, Mani. Good afternoon, all. Look, today, as Mani mentioned, we're actually going to walk through the 2 areas of security in identity and access management and information protection. In the last webinar, we discussed the market opportunity and gave you an overview of the end-to-end security story. Today, we're going to delve deeper into those 2 topics in identity and access management and information protection, right? So, as all of you would already know, there's a tremendous amount of disruption that's actually happened in the with regards to technology over the last 5 to 10 years. We've actually seen traditional IT being quite significantly disrupted with major themes in mobility and cloud. Yeah? We've actually seen users logging on to applications and from devices that are not typically in the organization's direct control, and apps logging on to apps that are actually not directly in the organization's control. So we actually had to rethink about what security would actually mean in this new landscape. How do we actually address the topics of the areas of any device, any location, any app in this new world of digital transformation? So the solutions that we're actually going to talk through today, they basically are orchestrated on addressing these new spaces and these new areas with the new challenges that our customers face today. Okay, so these are the 4 key areas that we typically think about when we think about security. So identity and access management, which we'll actually start with first, is all about protecting at the front door. Information protection is ensuring that information throughout its entire life cycle, all the way from when the information is created to the time that the information is destroyed, is protected in its entirety. Threat protection is all about ensuring that we keep the hackers out of a customer's network. And even if a hacker manages to breach into a customer's network, we're actually able to detect and respond as quickly as possible. And then intelligent security management is the glue that basically brings it all together. Okay, so identity and access management. First, we're actually going to focus on identity and access management. There's quite a few different capabilities in identity and access management that we actually wanted to walk you through. There will be a lot of other areas in identity and access management that we'll actually talk through in subsequent sections. So some of them will actually come up in the context of information protection, threat protection, and intelligent security management as well. What we're also going to leave you with at the end of this webinar is basically a couple of demonstrations. So a couple of end-to-end demonstrations of identity and access management and information protection. So with the deck of this specific session, you'll also have access to the end-to-end demonstrations of each of these areas. And we'll do the same thing when we actually do threat protection and intelligent security management in subsequent sessions. Okay, so one of the first things that we want to sort of draw your attention to in this session is why exactly is identity that important? Right? So we have a couple of very key statistics for you. One of the very, very key statistics here is that 81% of the total reported hacks have actually been linked back to the actual compromise of credentials, right? Just to emphasize, not to malware, not to software, but compromise of credentials. So yes, we actually do hear about some very, very prominent threats, which basically surface through malware and through backdoors in software and so on and so forth. But this statistic of 81% of the attacks being somehow linked to credential compromise, that's a very, very significant figure. And thus the significant focus on identity and access management from Microsoft. Okay, so then the other key statistic here is that 73% of passwords are in one shape or form passwords that are basically being reused. And we'll actually walk you through some of the reasons why we're actually seeing these trends emerge in the industry. Why is that so? Why is it so that passwords are actually being reused and somehow credentials are actually, most of the attacks, 81% of them, are actually linked to credentials in one form or the other? The reason for that is that we actually live in a world where there's lots and lots of different apps that people actually have access to. Everyone wants to be productive in those apps. To be productive, they actually need passwords that they can basically remember. Right? So if I'm actually trying to log on to my social media site, or I'm actually trying to log on to another social media site, so I personally actually have around 4 different social media sites that I actually use. Am I really going to give a password that is diametrically different from the password in one site? And am I actually going to then not reuse that password in my personal account, in the Microsoft account, or the account of some other entity, or perhaps my corporate credentials, right? Now, me being quite conscious of security and being a security architect, I actually opt to choose different passwords. But I have to confess, it actually becomes very difficult. It's not an easy thing to do, because when you actually have different passwords and you have different complexities in those passwords, and you actually have different sort of expectations on when those passwords should be reset, 30 days, 60 days, 90 days in a corporate sense, it becomes quite difficult to remember those passwords. So it is actually quite a significant challenge in terms of password management that we actually face today. Okay, so on this slide, we just wanted to present sort of a little snapshot of how the landscape actually looked before, before the digital transformation revolution actually set in, and how the landscape actually looks like right now. So previously I actually alluded to the fact that we come from a world where the devices that basically accessed an organization's corporate data were directly owned by the organization. We come from a world where typically users accessed that data from the customer's premises, right? So from a corporate network or perhaps through VPN. We come from an era where the apps that the user actually had access to were completely approved and sanctioned by the organization. So that's the before. We've actually seen a tectonic shift in how that before has actually become the now. So in the now, we actually have users wanting to bring their own devices to the organization. We have users wanting to use different SaaS apps because they actually help these users to be productive. We actually have users wanting to access data from all sorts of locations, not just the customer's corporate network. So then the fundamental question is, how do we actually apply the network security principles of yesterday to what the landscape looks like tomorrow? So throughout the course of this presentation, we'll actually attempt to answer some of these questions for you by demonstrating or by describing the solutions that we actually have in the market today that basically address each aspect of these solutions, of these challenges. Okay, so a net result of what the landscape looks like today is the fact that we actually have many, many identities today. I'll just use my example for a second. Personally, as a security architect, I actually have 3 different identities for 3 different social media platforms. I actually have an identity for my Microsoft account. I have an identity for my corporate credentials, and that's just 5 of the identities I actually have, right? So how do we actually ensure that we basically have one single strong identity in the corporate environment that is not then reused in some shape or form in all of these different avenues of engagement that people actually have today? So I alluded to this before. We treat identity as a new control plane. So what that basically means is that the control plane was basically network security before, right? Because if you can control the premises from which the user accesses the data, if you can control the devices from which the user accesses the data, and the apps which the user accesses the data from, which happen to be either in your network or a private cloud that's provided to you by a managed service provider, then the plane could very easily be network security. But today, the plane is actually identity because of all the different trends that I actually just mentioned in the previous slide, right? So people actually have their own devices, they're accessing the data from any location, and it can potentially be any app that lives in the customer's premises or that lives in the cloud. Yeah. So really, if we actually asked ourselves the question, what could that new plane be where we actually apply most of the controls? Identity actually emerges as one of those control planes, yeah, because people are actually going to still need identities to log on to these different apps from these different devices and in these different locations. Okay, so given the fact that identity is a control plane, there's a 3-pronged approach that we've actually created to implement a very robust and enterprise-ready identity and access platform. The first prong of that approach is to protect at the front door. So no matter where the user actually logs in from what device the user logs in from, or from what app the user wants to access, or the app could actually be on premises, the app could be in the cloud. So irrespective of what the mode of access is, or what the app that's being accessed is, we actually protect at the front door. We protect at that identity point. So when the user tries to access that specific application, that's where we actually protect. The second tenet of our 3-pronged strategy is to simplify access, because typically we actually see a lot of friction between security and productivity. Right? We actually see security becoming so overwhelming that there is sometimes a conscious effort made to sort of transgress that security because it's just so difficult. So what we try to do is we try to reduce the friction as much as possible between security and productivity. And then the third prong of that approach is that with that simplification, how do we actually ensure that the credentials are still safeguarded, right? So one of the approaches that, or one of the strategies that we actually use to simplify access is passwordless authentication, which we'll actually talk a lot about in the next few slides, right? But the reality is that we actually still have passwords that are actually here to stay, at least in lots, at least in the prevalent systems of the world of today, right, for the foreseeable future. So we need to have a strategy to ensure that those passwords are actually protected at any given point in time, right? So we actually do have a very robust strategy around safeguarding credential setup. Okay. So, given that context, we're actually going to walk you through different tenets of our technology. Yeah. So we're actually going to talk you through how we protect at the front door, how we simplify access through a passwordless world, or our vision of a passwordless world, and how we actually safeguard credentials. Okay. So let's start with the first one first, protect at the front door. The way we actually protect at the front door is by protecting access. What that basically means is we answer a very fundamental question or we attempt to answer a very fundamental question that our customers actually have today, which is how do we actually control access, or how much control do customers really have on the access to their applications? So given that context, let's just go through a couple of very critical questions in terms of determining the level of control our customers actually have on the access to their apps. So one of the first questions is, who's accessing the network? What is the role of the person that is actually accessing the network? Is the account of the person compromised? Where is the user typically based out of? Who's basically attempting to access this application? Is the user actually signing into the application from the location where the user typically signs into the application from, or is the user brand new location? What is the app that's actually being accessed? Is the device that the user logging on from managed or unmanaged? So these are some of the questions that you can actually ask your customers to determine the level of access our customers actually have on the access to apps and the sensitive data stored inside these apps. Okay, before we actually get into the different components that will help you address each of these questions that we mentioned in the previous slide, we just wanted to draw your attention to the intelligent security graph. So one of the very unique value propositions to market is that the intelligent security graph is a collection of massive scores and amounts of data that have actually been collected through Microsoft having an enterprise scale cloud and many consumer and corporate services across the globe. I just like to draw your attention to a few key statistics here. So there's over 450 billion authentications we actually handle on a monthly basis. There is over 1 billion accounts we actually have in our consumer and corporate identity system. There is around 1 billion pages we actually scan in Bing, 1 billion pages we actually serve in Bing. There's billions of devices we actually scan every day. All the intelligence being gathered from all these different endpoints is what feeds itself into the intelligent security graph. Intelligent security graph is basically a massive data warehouse that basically feeds all Microsoft security components and systems behind the scene. So for example, if your sign-in activity to CRM Online, as an example, is seen as suspicious, then that information is actually going to be fed to the intelligent security graph, and it's going to be available when you try to log on to Office 365 or Salesforce or Box or G Suite or anything that's basically powered by Azure Active Directory. So the Intelligent Security Graph, suffice it to say, is a very, very powerful and massive enterprise-scale security repository to collect intelligence, not just from machine-learned sources, but also from teams and digital, the botnet data from our digital crimes unit and law enforcement and our partners across the globe. Okay, so that actually brings us to Azure Active Directory. So Azure Active Directory is basically our identity and access management system in the cloud. Active Directory used to be our identity and access management system on premises, and it still is, and it's actually going strong. But when we actually talk about identity and access management in the cloud, Azure Active Directory is the solution. It actually has many, many key features. For example, conditional access, risk-based conditional access, multi-factor authentication, privileged identity management, which we'll actually go through during the course of this presentation. So I'd like to draw your attention to conditional access for a second, because that's a very, very significant value proposition of Azure Active Directory. So conditional access is all about ensuring that there are a certain predefined set of conditions that are actually stipulated by the customer, and based on those conditions, the access is regulated accordingly. So what that basically means is that instead of stating that you want multi-factor authentication for every single logon attempt in the organization and making the security experience overly disruptive, multi-factor authentication fatigue, we actually call it, or we like to think about it. What conditional access actually offers you is a very robust framework where you can basically say, based on the following conditions, we are going to put the following actions in place. So I'll give you a couple of discrete examples of that. Let's assume for 1 second that a user X is trying to access data in an application Y, and this application actually contains sensitive data. So you might put a conditional access policy in place that basically says, I'm only going to give access to application Y if user X is on a managed device. And I'm also going to put another condition in place, which is that not only does user X need to be on a managed device, but I'm actually going to restrict the locations from which user X can actually access this data. Because I don't really want user X to access this data from an airport kiosk, for example, right? Or an airport Wi-Fi. So that is the power that conditional access actually gives you. So not only does it actually allow you to apply controls like multi-factor authentication and resetting a password, it also allows you to put controls such as blocking access completely, resetting a password, or prompting users to reset a password because an authentication attempt was experienced that is basically not that is not deemed safe. It also allows you to limit access. So an example of that would be that if you are at an airport kiosk, just staying on an example, we can actually put a security policy in place that basically says that people can actually access documents from SharePoint Online, but access is going to be significantly limited. So for example, they're not going to be able to use the OneDrive for Business sync client to download data, but they're actually still going to be able to use that data in a very limited context. Yeah. Okay. Okay. Right. So just want you to have a very quick look at this slide, please. So it actually describes a very quick paradigm that we actually want information to be accessed. We want information to be accessed on any device, on any platform, and from any location. So to us, identity and access management is not just about identity and access management to just cloud applications or to specifically Microsoft cloud applications. When we think about identity and access management, we think about identity and access management on premises, in the Microsoft cloud, and to all SaaS applications that are actually powered by Azure Active Directory. So I'll give you a discrete example of that. So let's assume for 1 second that you actually want to control or you want to manage identity and access to applications on premises through a combination of Active Directory and Azure Active Directory. You can absolutely do that. Now let's extend that and basically say the Microsoft 365 and CRM Online, they're actually powered by Azure AD as well. So all the controls that we actually discuss here apply equally to Office 365 and Azure AD as they actually do to the on-premises one. Now these controls also apply equally to third-party SaaS applications. So later in this presentation, we'll actually talk about the cloud access security broker we actually have that basically gives you access to third-party SaaS applications and allows you to put controls in place for third-party SaaS applications. So we'll just ask a couple of very quick questions, and then we'll actually walk you through a range of technologies in the identity and access platform in Windows Hello for Business and Azure Active Directory, Privileged Identity Management, and Azure AD B2B and B2C. So a couple of questions that you might actually want to pose to your customers. Yeah. Do users struggle to remember complex passwords? Do users struggle to protect their credentials? Do you actually know of situations where users have actually used the same Office 365 credentials for consumer applications, or perhaps applications that are actually not directly managed by the organization? We make the deck available to you. You'll actually have all these questions that you can basically use in the context of workshops with your customers to basically ascertain what the current security profile is in the organization. Okay, so look, this is the undisputed fact in the industry today. No matter what degree of security is actually put on passwords, passwords are not secure. No matter how long they actually are, how complex they are, passwords are inherently an unsecure mechanism of accessing data. Yeah. So, what does a world look like that actually does not have passwords in it? Our solution to that is Windows Hello for Business. So we see Windows Hello for Business as not just an authentication mechanism for specific scenarios, but we see it as an authentication mechanism for every single scenario on lots and lots of different platforms. And over the next couple of slides, we'll quickly describe to you how that is going to be the case. So a couple of key things about Windows Hello for Business. It's designed, as I mentioned earlier, for all authentication scenarios and for right now it actually works on Windows 10, but because it's actually based on an open standard that we'll actually talk about next, it's supposed to be extended to lots and lots of different devices and platforms. It actually caters to scenarios where two factors of authentication on the same device are actually not satisfactory. So for example, in very regulated industries where having just one device for two factors of authentication is not acceptable, we actually allow for Windows Hello for Business companion devices. Even when biometrics is not available, Windows gives you the ability to log in through a PIN. So a PIN basically works on any kind of a device, whereas the biometrics actually work on over 100 device types that basically exist in the industry today. And finally, we actually have an API that's now open for developers and hardware vendors, where they can actually begin to incorporate Windows Hello for Business in their devices and in their apps as well. Okay, as I mentioned earlier, Windows Hello for Business is actually based on this spec here, FIDO 2.0. It's an industry regulation. In industry specification, we have lots of our competitors actually working on the same spec as well. And really the view is that one day we'll actually be passwords will not be required, and you'll actually be able to use technologies such as Windows Hello for Business that are actually based on FIDO 2.0 to log on seamlessly, so single sign-on to all these different applications. Okay, so some of the key characteristics of Windows Hello for Business: AD join, enterprise state roaming, and lots of other goodness that actually comes with Windows Hello for Business. Look, what I'm actually going to do is I'm just going to increase the pace a little because we still have a lot of content to go through, and we just want to leave some time for questions in the end. Okay, so Azure AD joining. So once your device is Azure AD joined with Windows Hello for Business, you can basically single sign-on to not just the Microsoft applications, but thousands and thousands of applications that are actually integrated with Azure AD. You can get enterprise state roaming, which basically means that your apps and settings can actually flow seamlessly from one Windows Hello for Business device to another Windows Hello for Business device. Okay. I just wanted to mention a couple of very quick things about Windows Hello for Business, and then what we'll basically do is we'll just delve into this slide here, which is basically about what is our strategy for passwords, right? So a couple of examples of what Windows Hello for Business is potentially expected to do in the future. So for example, we envisage a scenario, and we're actually actively working with our partners on this scenario that, this is over 1 second, you have a smartness band. And the moment you actually bring that band close to your machine, you can actually just tap the top of the band, and that basically helps you log into the machine. So it's basically scenarios like that. Windows Hello for Business is really expected to change the game in terms of passwordless access to applications, right? The reality, though, is that we still have passwords, and we actually need a very strong strategy to protect against password compromise. So what we basically do is we actually give you a unified portal called My Apps, and in this portal you can basically access lots and lots of applications from one unified location. You can actually manage your groups, and you can basically reset your password as well. So until passwords go away, we're actually trying to simplify the way passwords are actually used, so that you basically log on to one application or one portal, and then that actually gives you seamless access to lots and lots of different applications. Okay, so here's a few questions about protecting credential theft. I'll actually just give you a few seconds to please just have a quick look at the questions, and then we'll actually move to the next slide. Just one quick point on pass-through hashes. So the whole concept here is that once someone is actually successfully logged on, there's a token that's actually issued by a directory or a service to that specific machine. How do we ensure that that token is actually not compromised? That hackers can't just walk away with that token and then use that token to access different applications and basically compromise the user's identity. Okay, so although Windows Hello for Business basically gives you two factors of authentication in the same device, where one is a biometric or perhaps a PIN, and the second is the device itself, there are actually still vectors that we need to protect against with Windows Hello for Business. So a couple of things I wanted to draw your attention to. The actual credentials, which is the public and private key that are basically used to represent the user in this new passwordless world, they're actually protected on a TPM chip. So even if the device is compromised, a hacker is not going to be able to grab the public and private key of the user. We also protect against brute force attacks, and we actually we basically hired a team of people that have performed lots and lots of testing and have immense expertise ensuring that biometrics or the biometric tests can't be fooled. So for example, even if you hold a photo in front of the camera on your machine, it's not going to log you into Windows. So there's a lot of smarts there. Okay, so even if it actually happens that someone, that someone actually gets a hold of your machine, there is no way they can actually get to the token that's basically stored on your machine. So this slide basically calls out a feature that's just come in Windows 10. It's called Credential Guard. So it basically protects against that pass-through hash attack that I was actually talking about earlier. So you can't really take a user's token and then pass it to an application and authenticate as a user. You just won't have access to that specific hash or that specific token because that's isolated and that's put in a completely different virtualization container. Okay, so that actually brings us to privileged account management. There's three things we actually give you the ability to do with privileged account management in Azure AD. We allow you to discover all the user accounts that actually have persistent admin access. We allow you to revoke that persistent access, and we allow you to provide in its place just-in-time access. So for example, if user X needs access to Office 365 SharePoint Online or needs access to the whole tenancy as a global admin, they can basically go through a flow where the user account is actually granted the global admin role for a predefined amount of time. And after that, their access is revoked automatically. So that basically protects against someone having a lot of admin access and compromising the security of a customer when that admin access is, when that user account is itself compromised. Right. A couple of quick notes about Azure AD B2B and B2C. We'll send you a lot of information and collateral on where you can actually find out more about Azure AD B2B and B2C and what the services actually are. But suffice it to say, Azure AD B2B is our solution for seamlessly collaborating with anyone in your Office 365 tenancy that actually belongs to a partner organization or perhaps a customer organization. And Azure AD B2C is all about enabling or lighting up social identities in your application, which basically means that you can actually allow your customers and your users to log on to applications with their social identities, may that be Facebook or Google or LinkedIn or whatever they might actually be. Okay, so with that, we actually have around 20 minutes, so I'm just going to quickly run through the information protection section content we actually have for you here, and we'll make this deck. And once again, to recap, the deck and the end-to-end demonstration scenarios available to you after this session, and you're most welcome to reach out to us if you actually have any subsequent questions. Right. Okay. So information protection. Given the precursor and given the context that we sort of started this session with, the information protection landscape has actually changed quite significantly as well, because information is no longer constricted in the bounds of the organization. It's something that actually flows seamlessly in the cloud, on premises, and on different devices. So here are some key statistics that we'd actually like to draw your attention to. So there's 80% of organizations that actually allow bring your own devices today. There are an average of 730 cloud apps that are actually being used, right? So coming from a world, these statistics are just basically to highlight the point of how much the shift has actually happened, not just in the context of identity and access management, but in information protection as well. We're actually seeing a massive shift in the devices, in the apps, and in the locations where users are creating information and then working with this information. So to illustrate the point, let's just quickly go through the journey of a file, right? From the time that a file is created, let's assume for a second that this is an Excel file on a Surface Pro device. From the time it's actually created, that file might actually be stored on a file share, it might actually be stored in Office 365, it might be stored in Box or Dropbox or G Suite or wherever that file is actually stored, right? And then that file might actually be disseminated via email or perhaps external sharing in any of these different applications, SaaS applications. And then that file may actually end up in another organization, with users of another organization, where the entire lifecycle of the file and the sensitivity of the file are both things that are actually not addressed. Right? So the world that we're actually in today, unless there is an information protection solution in place, the entire life cycle of the file, from the time that it's actually created to the file, to the time that it actually travels through this hybrid paradigm of on-premises and the cloud and different organizations and different devices. It's not protected unless there is a very significant focus placed on an information protection strategy that actually addresses all phases of this life cycle. Okay, so we want to describe our approach here in this slide, right? So essentially our approach spans 4 different areas. It spans detection, classification, protection, and monitoring. Now, over the next few slides, we'll actually walk you through each of these different phases. Okay, let's talk about the detect phase first. So what does detection really mean? So detection basically means that you look at all the information that you actually have on premises or in the Microsoft Cloud and Office 365 or perhaps CRM Online or in third-party SaaS applications in Box and Dropbox, and you actually try to determine what content is safe and what content is what content is sensitive and what content is not sensitive, and what is the different sensitivity levels of all of this content. Yeah. So detection is really about determining what content should be protected and how it should actually be protected. Okay, so one of the things that we actually focus in detection is to actually detect anywhere. As I mentioned before, we actually detect on premises. We actually want to detect in Office 365, and we actually want to detect in third-party SaaS applications. So for on-premises, we have a tool called AIP Scanner that you can actually use to scan on-premises content stored in SharePoint libraries or file shares. In Office 365, you can actually use Office 365 Data Governance, and that will actually allow you to detect sensitive content. And then with our Cloud Access Security Broker, CAS, you can actually look at third-party SaaS applications, and it will actually allow you to detect sensitive content stored in these third-party SaaS applications. Okay, so you'll actually see this word used a lot in the Microsoft information protection story, sensitive information types. So for those folks who've actually worked with Office 365 Security and Compliance Center, this is something that we actually use very widely in SharePoint Online and Exchange Online, right? So sensitive information types are basically a description of the type of information that you actually want to protect. Sensitive information type could actually be credit card numbers. Sensitive information type could actually be personally identifiable information, or it could actually be any information type that's basically deemed sensitive by your organization. So you can actually put a set of regular expressions to define your sensitive information type. So we also give you the ability to create new sensitive information types or to reuse sensitive information types that actually exist already. Okay. So once again, sensitive information types. So the sensitive information type framework that we actually provide you in all our different technologies, in the AIP Scanner or Office 365 Advanced Data Governance or Cloud App Security, is very comprehensive. So built-in sensitive information types plus customized sensitive information types. So once you've actually detected the information, what actually happens next with that information? You basically classify the information in the second phase of the information protection lifecycle. So here are some key considerations for you. So what are the sensitive information types that are very important to the specific organization that you're actually working with? We need to customize any sensitive information types. Do we need to customize the classification and label schemes, right? So these are typically some of the questions that you'll actually ask upfront of your customer when you're actually workshopping their information protection strategy. Okay. So once you've actually asked all of those questions, then you would actually assign certain labels to that information. Now, that label can actually be manual or automated. That label can actually be recommended, or that label because sometimes the company and the IT department actually they don't really have a comprehensive way of describing or defining a taxonomy. Then the whole notion of a taxonomy actually comes in, which basically means that you can basically give users the ability to recommend their own labels to the subsystem. So not only do we actually give you a robust way of implementing classification through a manual and automated manner, and we can actually recommend labels for you as well. We also give users the ability to change labels in documents, provide a justification, and then actually recommend new labels that should basically be added to the taxonomy of the organization as well. Okay. So what really are labels, right? So why this emphasis on labels? Because once you actually have your information labeled, then you can perform a lot of protection actions on it or content lifecycle management actions on it, right? So essentially with labels, what basically happens is that you actually have metadata that's actually written into the document itself or the email itself, right? So if it's an email, then the metadata is actually going to be, the label information is going to be put in the HTTP headers, right? And with documents, it's actually going to be put in the document metadata. Once you actually have these labels defined on these documents and emails, then you can basically subject these labels to a data loss prevention mechanism like one built in Office 365, and you can actually start applying some advanced protection to it. So labels are absolutely critical to this information protection story. Okay. So once again, protection actions is one use case for labels. So this slide basically answers the question why, whereas the previous slide was what exactly are labels. So not only can you actually apply protection actions once you have a label on a specific piece of content, you can actually put retention policies in place and expiration policies in place, and basically manage the entire life cycle of the content. You actually have a couple of different kinds of policies. You have global policies and you actually have scope policies. So you can basically scope policies to specific groups and specific departments and so on and so forth, whereas global policies are things that you actually apply at an organizational level. Now, from a user perspective, all they'll actually see is an amalgamation of global and scope policies. So they're actually not going to see two different kinds of policies. So the end user experience is very smooth. This is basically an admin level distinction. Okay, so here we actually have an example of a label for you. Yeah, so once again in the deck, you'll actually see a couple of nice examples of what labeling actually looks like. And we actually have a pretty nice policy tips framework. So the users can actually get policy tips in context as they actually work with that content. Okay, so that actually brings us to the protect phase of the information protection lifecycle. So protect is all about ensuring that once a piece of content is labeled, there are certain protection actions applied to it. On this slide, you'll actually see some of the different kinds of protection actions that you can actually apply to content once it's actually labeled. You can actually apply protection actions in device level protection. You can basically protect content as it actually is in transit. You can protect content as it actually gets stored in different SaaS applications. So let's have a very quick look at device level content protection. Right? So there's some of the protection actions you can actually apply at a device level. So we actually offer you mobile device management and mobile application management. So what you can basically do is you can apply MDM policies through Intune, and that actually enable you or allow you to protect content at a device level. We also have a very robust information protection mechanism built into Windows. So through Windows information protection, you can basically protect contents on Windows 10 machines. So not only can you actually protect content on iOS and Android devices via Intune, you can also protect information protected content on Windows through Intune through this robust framework called Windows Information Protection. Okay. Our approach of a hybrid strategy. So it's not just Windows that we actually think about, as I mentioned before, in the information protection world. We actually offer you a very robust mechanism of protecting information on iOS and Android devices as well. And iOS and Android are basically, just an example of the different platforms that we're actually looking at. You can protect information in different SaaS applications as well. Mobile application management policies basically allow you to ensure that even if the devices are not directly managed by you, you're actually able to protect the information in the constraints of the different applications that the information is being accessed on. So for example, you can actually say on an iPhone that's not managed by my organization directly, I still want users to be able to look at my Word documents or Excel files or PowerPoint files stored in Office 3 and emails via Outlook. But I'm actually going to containerize these applications so that that data cannot flow outside the organization. So for example, a user can't take a sensitive piece of content out of a Word document and put that in a WhatsApp message. Yeah? So you can absolutely protect against scenarios like that. Okay, so once you've actually defined the protection policies at a device level, we also have a very robust set of DLP, data loss prevention policies, available in Office 365 and Azure. Once again, we'll actually give you a very nice end-to-end demo video at the end that will actually demonstrate this. But for now, you can basically, please feel free to log on to the Security and Compliance Center, that's protection.office.com in Office 365, and you'll actually find a very robust DLP framework there. So here's an example of what Office 365 DLP can do. So it's suffice it to say it's extremely powerful, and you can basically protect not just your documents with Office 365 DLP, but you can also protect your emails quite comprehensively. So here we basically describe another solution we actually have for email protection called Office 365 Message Encryption. What this basically allows you to do is to basically protect emails so that you control the access to emails, in the sense that only users with the predefined access can basically access that email. That protected email can actually be accessed from any device and any platform. So it's not a device or platform agnostic. Sorry, it's not a device or platform specific thing. It's a device agnostic thing. So it's a very robust piece of technology that works quite beautifully with the rest of the information protection story to actually give you comprehensive protection on your emails. Okay, so that actually brings us to the protection of other SaaS applications, right? So we actually have a very robust third-party SaaS application protection capability in this Cloud Access Security Broker. We actually have called Cloud App Security, or MCAS, and there's actually some great information protection feature set that it actually gives you, along with the actual discovery of other third-party SaaS applications that might actually be of use in your organization. Okay, so that actually brings us to the other aspect of information protection, which is data governance. So data governance is all about looking at labels that have been applied to information stored in your organization and basically putting that through a content lifecycle management policy regime. So what that basically means is that for sensitive information, you don't want to keep the sensitive information in your organization longer than how or should I actually describe it this way, longer than the expected time frame or the life cycle of that information. So for example, if there's a very sensitive document and it's not required anymore, there should be policies and procedures that are actually in place that basically delete that document or revoke access to that document in a timely manner, so that the security of the organization is not compromised. That is exactly the kind of thing we actually give you with data governance. So not only for Office 365 once again, but you can actually apply data governance policies through Cloud App Security on third-party SaaS applications as well. Okay, that actually brings us to the final aspect of information protection, which is monitor and respond. So monitor and respond is all about ensuring that once the information is detected, classified, and protected, you actually monitor the life cycle of that information. Yeah. Is it possible for customers today to actually see the life cycle of their sensitive information, to revoke access to that information, to ensure that that information is retained and destroyed as per the organizational policies? Those are some of the things that monitoring basically gives you. So monitoring actually gives you, monitoring and responding in the Microsoft information protection story gives you a very good view of how the information policies in your organization are actually performing. So that's that in a nutshell. That's what monitoring and responding is all about. Okay, so visibility and response, as we actually discussed already. So it's actually all about providing you the visibility and giving you the ability to actually respond to information protection events as they actually happen. So for example, someone has actually performed an information protection action. For example, it has shared a document that's sensitive with someone outside your organization. Can you actually respond to that specific action in a timely manner? So it's all about, one, giving you the visibility, and second, giving you the tools to actually respond to it. So here are some of the key feature sets that Office 365 monitoring gives you. Once again, in the Office 365 Security and Compliance Center, we actually have a very comprehensive set of capabilities for you to actually monitor information, and you can basically set lots of policies in place as well that basically determine that when there is DLP violations in Office 365, you can actually configure email notification, you can actually block those actions from going through, or you can actually provide in-context policy tips you can actually then use. So then the final dimension of monitoring is document access and sharing. So this is all about ensuring that you actually have complete visibility of how the document is being accessed and shared in your organization, sensitive content, that is. We actually give you a very nice dashboard in Microsoft Information Protection, Azure Information Protection, that will actually give you this view. Who's accessed sensitive information and what time? And you can actually revoke access to that content as well. We also give you visibility of other SaaS applications, as I was actually mentioning. So anytime we actually talk about the visibility to third-party SaaS application or responding to monitoring events in third-party SaaS applications, our solution is our Cloud Access Security Broker, which is an industry leader in the Cloud Access Security Broker space called MCAS. So here's basically the Microsoft products that we actually offer you in the information protection space, categorized by the 4 phases of information protection: detect, classify, protect, and monitor. And over time, we'll actually keep adding more and more products and more services in a much more integrated manner to this information protection story. So on this slide, you'll actually find a nice summary when you get the deck that basically describes all the different technologies and products we actually have in the Microsoft Information Protection stack. And we wanted to conclude by basically saying that it's really, really easy to get started with information protection because it's all baked into our products. So Windows Information Protection is baked into Windows 10. Intune is a part of Enterprise Mobility Security, which is a part of Microsoft 365's the Microsoft 365 suite all up. And information protection is deeply baked into Office 365 as well. And Cloud App Security, our Cloud Access Security Broker that we basically use to each of these different phases and detect, classify, protect, and monitor across on-premises applications and in the cloud and in third-party SaaS applications. Cloud Access Security Broker, or MCAS, is what basically does it for us for all the third-party SaaS applications. So on that note, let me please just conclude by saying that we actually have a huge set or huge plethora of capabilities in identity and access management and information protection. We actually have a coming up. We did the first of these security boot camps, the very first in Australia in January this year. There's a couple coming up in Melbourne and Brisbane towards the end of March. We would absolutely love to see some of you there, or all of you there, if that's possible. In that bootcamp, we basically have 13 to 14 different topics across identity and access management, information protection, threat protection, and intelligence security management. So suffice it to say, we actually go through a lot of detail at 400 level to basically describe what these different capabilities across these 4 different areas can do for you. Mani will actually post a whole raft of collateral after this session, including the end-to-end demonstrations for each of these scenarios. And we'll record the threat protection and intelligence security management topics, and we'll actually make that available to you through the usual channels as well. So on that note, we are a little over time. If there are any questions and you folks are actually okay to stay online for a couple of minutes, we'd be more than happy to answer them. Otherwise, we can answer them on Yammer. Yep. Okay. Thank you so much for your time, all. Please don't hesitate to send your questions.
Kenny, we do have a question. Sorry.
Please go.
Sorry, I was on mute. So from Damien, can you apply an AIP labels on an SPO document libraries? And can you specify the default library label?
Okay, all right. Okay. So is the question that can we actually apply labeling at a SharePoint Online document library level rather than a Word or Excel or file level? Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. So yes, we can.
Beautiful. Okay. Any other questions from anyone on the call? Damien's just put another question in there. UIs. There are guides on. Are there guides on that?
Yeah. So what we can actually do, Mani, is we'll pull up the specific articles that describe how that's done, and we'll actually flick it across.
So I'll pop that onto the SharePoint versus the landing page for you, Damien, after this call. Kenny, if you can just send that to me. Any other questions with acronyms I didn't know? No? Okay. Well, thank you everyone for your time. We had a big crowd today, so thank you once again. You will be receiving an email for your third week and the challenge, and all the content in that email will be around assessments that you can take to build out your technical skills. And as Kenny said, we will be publishing the videos of those other two areas that we didn't cover today in the live community call. So with that, I'm going to close the call and thank you for your time.